So my name is Hendryx-Parker. I am a CTO and co-founder of 6 Feet Up, and we are a Python and cloud consulting company. We do a lot of work. Over our 20 years, we've done a lot of Plone work, content management work, and more recently have moved into a much more work in the Django application server, so doing things with Django framework. And we wanted to translate some of the ideas we had used when we did our work with Plone into something that was maybe still usable in the Django application framework. So I want to talk to you guys about that today. That's a little bit about who this guy is, also co-organizer of the IndyPy group. So I want to thank them for putting this event on, and thank you to the crew who's been helping put this all together. So about workflows. If you saw the earlier session on workflow from Anthony, he talked a lot about the Plone workflows, and I actually have the benefit of a few years ago at the Plone Boston conference, I was the one who put together the training section in training.plone.org for the workflow area, which has subsequently been updated by numerous people in the community. Huzzah to open source software. But it gives me a little bit of background in what we've used workflows for before and what I had an idea we should be able to do in Django with other kinds of applications. So that's kind of what I want to go over here. So generally what are workflows? When we're talking about series of interactions to complete a task, you find them all over the place. I mean, if you are working in a company setting and you want to request time off, there's typically a workflow. There are, the idea of requesting it, getting approval, or getting it denied. These are all part of a workflow. Sometimes they're formal, sometimes they're very informal, but they all can focus around business or rules. I mean, a workflow is typically, I mean, we're going to talk specifically about a subset of workflow, or a workflow is specifically a subset of state, something we call state. Which brings us to the title of the talk and using finite state machines. What are finite state machines? But they are just a mechanism. It's a fancy word to talk about this model we use in computer programs to model this change between state. So a finite state machine is a finite number of states associated with transitions. So we're going to talk about basically states being the bigger objects and the transitions being the lines you draw between them. And we'll have a few visuals to go over that. And that transition being a set of actions that starts from one state and ends in another, or even in the same state. So we'll actually show some examples of that as well, where a transition doesn't always mean it goes into another place. So I think we need to kind of start with a simple example. If we think about a simple publication workflow, maybe something we would have done with Plone's workflow tool called DC Workflow, it was very simple yet very powerful. The thing we're describing here is that there are two states represented by the various circles on the slide here, and those lines between them. So there is a transition to publish, which takes it from private to published, and then there's a transition to retract that same item, which takes us from published back into that private state. You may be asking, what is this syntax up above? So there's a tool called Graphiz that we can actually use to help model these, and it'll come in very handy later. I'll give you some bonus material and some tips and tricks on how this actually can help you later with solving and verifying that you are doing the right things with your workflow states inside of the Django tool, for example. Actually, this works in Plone as well. But now we have an automated tool that we can use to describe workflows and get a visualization. So if you ran this through the Graphiz program, you would get a diagram that looked pretty close to what's there. Now, what's not shown that is actually part of this scope of workflows and talking about finite state machines is we're not showing here who is allowed to do what. A lot of times workflows involve permissions and what role people play in those various areas of a workflow itself. And another thing we're not truly describing, or a problem we're actually trying to solve, is that when is something truly a Boolean? If you think about a place where workflows can actually really come in handy, is that when you have tried to describe a state of an item on your model. So if you're familiar with Django and you build your Django models, you may have an item that needs to be batch processed through some external process. And on that item, you've put a Boolean field called processed, and it's either true or false. But when it comes to a state, well, processed and pending, So if it starts off as unchecked and it's really a pending processing and hasn't been completed yet, think about the in-between state. As that item goes to be processed, something has picked it up off maybe a query to go do external processing. It's technically not in a state you have described in your model. That Boolean field only has two options available to it, and really you've got a third state there, which is processing or in process or pending, so that if you had more than one worker picking up these kinds of items off of a queue to process them, it wouldn't pick up the ones that are currently in process by another state. So this is an area where a checkbox on a model is definitely not the best solution for tracking these kinds of states. So it may be tempting to do this, but I think I'll hopefully explain to you a better way and a nice little framework for doing that with some other tools inside of Django. So if we extend this into collaboration, one of the really common use cases is for, like, in the side of a CMS, you've got pages you want published to the public, you've got pages that are in draft and only private to maybe the owner of the page, and you have other states in there. For example, you may want to send it for review and actually have someone who has a manager status or role inside the site review those items before they actually become published. So this is much more how Plone works with the DC workflow engine, is that I can own an item, reviewers can't see it until I actually push it over into their workflow state, where they now have permissions, which changes the state and the permissions on the item, allowing them to see it. But let's talk a little bit about real world, other kinds of things other than what we did in the CMS world. So if we talk a little bit about real life, and I'm sure a lot of people in the audience have been students at a university. And if you've been a student at a university, there is a process you would have to go through if you wanted to, for example, change your major or go through a program change. So you would go to the registrar's office, or I'm so far out of the university world, I forget where you go to actually change your major. But if you wanted to change your major, there's a process you go through, which involves typically filling out some number of forms, going through some number of approvals, being accepted into some other program, and then you approving with any other changes that are happening along the way. And this can be described, I mean, this is one example of a state workflow that we've put together as part of a project that did this, where a program change application would be in progress. So you can see this kind of beginning state up here, then can be submitted. Either it is accepted and goes into complete, or it's being rejected and you need to resubmit for in progress again. And each of these states, what's not being shown is the who can do what here. And so I've got another example that has a little more color coded that we'll go over. But you can see that basically all the circles are your states, all the lines are your various transitions. And this is actually a fairly straightforward application. But even a straightforward application can have many, many different kinds of states that a piece of content or business model can be in. And you need to be able to track those things in a logical way. And more importantly, you need to control who can perform these various operations. And you need to be able to do that in a way that is easy to track, easy to audit, easy to repeat, so that things don't go wrong halfway through the process. And by the way, feel free to ask questions in the Slack channel. I've got it open kind of below on my screen down below. So if there are questions along the way, happy to ask them and answer them. Another real world example that can be applied to this is, for example, if we worked with a company who's doing cancer research. So if you were researching cancer and wanted to be able to track case reports for about patients along the way as you were studying them, you would have different actors inside this workflow. So potentially the person submitting the case report for review. So in the initial state here would start at the I'm going to create a new case report and save it. Once it's saved, it goes into a draft state. So that's where you see the blue. So the blue is going to be the author. The red is going to be an administrator. And when it's live, we actually have a different color down here, which means that no one can edit it technically. So it should be in a fairly immutable state unless it is redacted or requested to be revised by the author or an admin, which will put it into a state where, for example, we can allow editing of that item specifically. Now, I mentioned that the workflow's transitions can actually end an item back up in the exact same state. And as we get into some of the code that powers this example here, we will see that, for example, when I click edit, as a transition, it basically kicks off in response to that edit transition a save. So I'm allowed to edit it. So as I edit, I basically save it back into the exact same state. Now, once I submit, it goes into a different workflow state where I, as the author of the item, am not allowed to actually save the item anymore. It was not in my realm or my permission or my role to be able to save that item. Only administrative users of the site would have the ability to edit and save. Now, if they did edit and save, we can control that the author would be able to review those changes and approve them. So that's what this little side, there's basically a side workflow working off to the side over here involved in the whole same process, that as I've gone through processing, it can either be sent back to the author for review, or if you send it to the author for review of those edits, they can either approve or they can make the edits themselves, and then following the same thing, submit, which is submit, basically taking it back to processing for the admins again. And once live, once it's gone through the publish transition down here at the bottom, the item will be considered live and then immutable to authors and administrators. So we can actually ensure that the item hasn't been tampered with, at least from the application, coming in through the front door of the application. And one thing I've also got in here is that sometimes workflows can be automatic. A transition can be started or triggered by an event or a condition. So you may not have manually clicked a button in the UI to actually allow a workflow to trigger a transition, but it could be triggered by an event or a condition inside the system itself. So on entry to a specific workflow state, it could be that there's before or after actions that can then trigger, for example, if you're uploading files as part of your application process, we may want to not allow the files to be seen by anyone in the system until they have been virus checked. So sending those for the virus checking process would actually have its own workflow on those files that are triggered automatically. The virus checking process gets triggered on upload. The checking process would change the state of the workflow to either clean or infected. And then if it is clean, can come back around, back into the system. So none of those workflow transitions were actually fired by a human, but we are tracking state all along the way, so we can actually then review, maybe in an audit log, every step of the way that object has gone through our process. So again, what does this have to do with Django? So if we want to get back to using this all with Django, my background being more with Plone, I was like, I want to be able to use Django to do some of the similar things where we were building business applications in Plone, taking content objects through Plone and applying business logic rules to them using the DC workflow engine. So Django is opinionated, but it's not very opinionated when it comes to the idea of permissions and roles. And then logging them and kind of handling those roles, permissions, and authentication bits for content is pretty much informal and kind of left up to the developer to figure out how they want to do it. Typically a Django dev flow is like build your models, expose the admin, and then build some views. And at some point you want like restrictions, and so will start modifying those views to only show things with certain characteristics or criteria from the query. Now, without a framework to manage all this code can get spread across the models, the views, the management commands and forms. It'll be put in middleware. And so there's kind of a spaghetti code of stuff that really starts happening. And it really depends on the person who implemented it to describe it to the next developer as they onboard them. So you'll end up building custom queries and spreading them everywhere. So if we had a way to be able to track who can do what and when, that would be really awesome, right? The when part's really the tricky bit. So you want to be able to know at any point in time, depending on the state of that model in your database, may depend on who can interact with it and perform what transitions. And I'll have some bonus material later about being able to actually run through it and audit that as well. So if we wanted to do this, I think one of the things that's encouraged in the Django community is to build fat models. So building a fat model and having thin views allows you to encapsulate a lot of that logic onto the models themselves. And from a convenience standpoint as a developer, that means there's one place to go look as a developer to find out where the logic is for how something may move through a process, or how we determine what permissions or guards are maybe protecting the item as someone goes to edit it, versus spreading this across the views and having lots of layers of abstraction, which is actually much more like what Plone does in some areas, which can be a little daunting for a new developer to come up to walk up to and be able to build their own add-ons. So if we follow this technique and build an add-on to manage Django workflows, wouldn't that be just an awesome thing to have? Which I would agree, and luckily someone did it. It's called Django FSM, which stands for Finite State Machine. What's nice about the Django FSM framework is it's going to be a reusable framework for tracking these business rules applied to your models, and it gets everyone mentally aligned, because we're going to say that everything dealing with workflow and the business processing of specific kinds of objects inside our system are all going to operate under the framework of this finite state machine provided by Django FSM. So if you want to get going, it's open source. It is on GitHub. It's very easy to get started. You can add it to your requirements file or your pip file, or you can just pip install and pip install Django FSM, and it will bring it into your project. And now we basically have what I feel like is a simple approach to a complicated problem. It's simple because there's only a few moving parts to really get started, and we'll cover those today in the talk. So the basics of Django FSM is you're going to have a custom model field that you can add to each of your models that you want to have this workflow process be tracked under. So you will create a variable or a field on your model using the FSM model, and I'll show you some examples of how we do that. We'll specify the various workflow states, and then we'll have inside of our model a Python decorator for transitions. So each method of our model that we decorate with a transition will specify a source state, a target state, some kind of permissions, and a few other extra things that can be in there. And then we get some, I wouldn't say it's magic, it's actually part of core Django. We get additional methods injected into our model by Django FSM that allows us to query our model based on our FSM field state, so whatever workflow state we're currently in, and retrieve valid transitions that are available to the current user in the context of them being logged into the site. So this is it's really fun usage of the contribute to class here. I had to actually ask someone else what this all meant, and they're like, this is my favorite part of the code, because they really used something that was probably not supposed to be exposed, but you know what? There's not an underscore in front of it, so it's fair game to be used. So we are using this contribute to class to, in our instance, Django FSM is using it to inject some helper methods onto our current model without us having to write that logic from scratch. So it gives us some nice convenience methods. So to get started with like the very basics, if we're looking at the FSM field, I've got an example here of that case report. So if we're doing the cancer research project as one of our examples, there'll be title plus whatever other fields are part of our normal model. And then we've got some workflow controlled fields. So we do still have some Boolean fields in here, but those Boolean fields are typically going to be controlled by the transitions. And as we go through various state gates or transitions inside the model, we may check these or uncheck these Boolean fields as part of the workflow process, but they're typically controlled as part of the workflow. When we actually set up our FSM field, we will have a set of choices. So it's just a tuple of text, choices like states, new, default, initial, processing, all those circles that were on our diagram, and now are becoming the choices for our workflow states. Then the default state would be when an item is created and you've not chosen a specific state, you will get this initial state defined as your default state for that workflow state. And then the normal help text you'd have on a Django form for that. So we basically created a workflow state variable on our model that now contains the current state of our item or our model or instance of our model inside of our database. And as a side note, there's an additional field that comes with Django FSM called FSM integer fields. So if you want to be able to store enumerated states or an integer that corresponds to some constant inside your application, because maybe you'll be changing the text or localizing that text later, you could use the FSM integer field for that if you want to store enumerated states instead of strings. So it's easy to do. Now, if we want to define these choices and these states, we can look, in our case, we built basically a convenience class that contained information about our workflow states. So we can see here, there's the kind of string representation of what our workflow states are. And then here is that choices that we're importing and using inside of our FSM field as our set of choices. So the draft, admin review, author review, and live, which were the states we saw back on the previous slide. And then our initial state of draft. So you can see that there's draft as, draft inside of our model. So how do we get to these states? So you have to get between the circles using transitions. So here's probably one of the simplest examples you could have would be for our model, because our model can actually have multiple workflow states tracked in a single model. You're not limited to just one workflow state. You could actually track multiple parallel workflows kind of going in parallel at the same time with each object. We specify the transition decorator as part of the FSM package and specify which workflow state we're going to be acting the transition against. And then you have to say which source workflow state the item can be in, what permission, and I'll show you an example of writing that, but it's basically a callable that determines whether you are allowed to access this transition or not. And then if the transition is successful, what workflow state it will go into. And you'll notice this one is draft and draft. So I think if we went backward to the diagram here, here we go. You'll notice that we're describing this top figure right up here, the edit save. That is exactly what's happening. We're going from the draft state to the draft state. And you may be like, well, why? I don't understand why would even do that. Like, it doesn't make sense why I would have this transition that does nothing other than pass and even takes me right back into the same state I was in. The key reason we would do that is going to be this permission. By using the Django FSM product and the FSM field and these transitions, we can now produce a set of allowed actions that are like role and permission and context aware. So when I come to a Django view that I've created, I can now query for the available transitions that are available to me as my current user and not globally available to everybody. So in this case, if I was the author of the item and the item was in the draft state and the can edit says I'm the author and can edit it, when I retrieve the list of available transitions for workflow state, edit will be one of them and allowed for me. So I can now programmatically display buttons or fields on my form that are relative to my level of permission for that item at this point in time. Now there is an additional, I said the target is what workflow state this will go into if the transition is successful. If there was code inside this specific transition and there was some kind of exception handling, you can actually handle that and make sure your object transitions into a different state on error. So you can actually add an argument to this decorator called on error and specify another, maybe it's a dead letter queue or some on error state that you want to send the items to for processing. And it could even be automatic processing where it does some kind of cleanup process that any items coming through and in that state now get picked up, processed, fixed, put back into the draft state, and then now you're ready to be edited again. That could all be happening because there was an error and you catch it with the FSM product. Now, if we look at a little more, I guess, involved example, remember I mentioned there were two other Boolean fields that were involved in this workflow state, this author approved and admin approved. So if we look at the transition again, we're still dealing with the same workflow state FSM field. Now we're going from a source of author review, and we're going to, this transition is called approve. So if the current user, if the item's in author review and the current user satisfies the can submit permission, they will see the approve transition available to them when they call the get workflow state transitions. And then when they actually action that workflow, if this is all successful, it will end up in the admin review state automatically. And along the way, we can now do things like flip some Booleans on our model. And then we can also attempt to send an email with notifications. These are all kinds of things we can have happen inside that transition. And there's other ways we can actually do things like send emails, or if we want to hook in third-party packages that can listen for these state changes. And I'll show you that how that works here later in the presentation. Now, getting back to permissions. So if you saw on the previous, this slide right here, these permissions, the transitions can contain permissions or lists of conditions. And they're all just callables that can determine whether, based on the user, the current user, whether they are satisfied to, true or false, do the thing or don't do the thing. So if we look at one of these permissions, like for example, can edit, one of the first things you're going to notice is, we try and get the user, but if there's not a user, we may need a way to determine what user is actually running this transition so that we can make a determination on whether they are allowed to see this edit function or not. So for example, if you were running from the Python Django debug prompt, or you were doing a management command, there wouldn't be a user in the request necessarily, but you may still want to be able to call the edit transition because you really want to strictly adhere to changing the value of the workflow state variable only through transitions. Like kind of once you've gone all in on saying we're going to do Django FSM and we're going to do everything with the workflow states, modifying that workflow state variable by hand can obviously have pretty detrimental effects. Like you may not actually have other things happen because you had side effects that were supposed to occur inside transitions, for example. So we can actually, in our case, we created a custom middleware that will determine if you're running a management command, for example, it would try and find your user ID from the server and use that as your username. And based on who you are on the server and who your user lines up to inside the actual application, we can now determine if, for example, if the workflow state is in draft, retracted, or author review, and the current user is the author, then great, you are allowed to edit. If the workflow state, on the other hand, if the workflow state is in admin review and the user is staff, then you're allowed to edit. Otherwise, you don't get the edit functionality. So this is how that permission basically gets called, and then we can now determine whether the user can even see that transition available to them, as long as they're calling the API for Django FSM to grab that available set of transitions. Here's another example, very similar. Who's allowed to submit? Basically, all we need to do is ensure that you're the author of the item, because that's the only transition that deals with submitting is going from the author to an admin. So we just check to see if the current user's email matches up with the current primary author's email on the actual model itself. And if so, we return true. Otherwise, it returns false, and they can't see the submit action at all. Like, for example, if it was an admin user or an administrator or reviewer on the site. So I kind of mentioned earlier about these convenience methods that get scribbled onto our model for us. And these are the three, I guess they're not meta, they're real methods that get put onto your model automatically by the Django FSM. Just the pure fact that you have an FSM field added to your model will now add these special methods to your actual model object. And in the cases where it's field in all caps, that would get replaced with your name of your field variable. So in the case of our previous example, we are using workflow_state as the variable name for our field. So we would be able to get all the declared transitions, no matter who we were, if we did get all workflow_states transitions, and that would return to us a list of everything. So edit and submit and all the publish would all be available to us. Now the next one here is probably more important, is like available and available user. So this gives us available transitions in the current state. So if we go back and look, I should have put the graphic right here so we could kind of refer to it. If I am in the author review state, there's going to be two workflow transitions available to me. There's going to be an edit transition and an approve transition. But if I'm in the processing state, and I call that same method, I will get a publishing transition, an edit transition, and a send back transition returned as part of that call. So this allows me now to have the UI respond depending on the workflow state of the item. And then basically the next one is going to be similar, except in the context of the current user. So it's going to use that permission argument of the transition to determine, via that whatever true or false return value from that permission, whether I can actually see those transitions or not. So now if you put all this in your view, you will always get the correct actions available to that user for that model, depending on what state it's in and what user you're currently viewing the items as. So these are all coming from that contribute to class that FSM automatically added these to your model for you. That's kind of the basics of Django FSM. Now there's some other niceties that you get as part of using Django FSM is that there are some signals. So if you can subscribe to the pre-transition and post-transition signals, if you need to do some kind of pre-processing or some cleanup of the items afterward, you can now do that as part of your cleanup process or your post-processing process. Or for example, in post-transition, if you're sure that the transition was successful, you could use that as part of your notification process. Now you can hook into this very easily from third-party products. When you call when these signals get called, they're going to be passed the model class. So the sender, in this case, like the case report, for example, the class itself, and then the instance of the class. So you'll actually have like what all the data is inside the instance of it currently, the transition name that's being called, the source model state, and the target model state. So if we look at the example of using this signal, and we can see right here, we are registering the post-transition signal, connecting up the case report workflow transitions, which is this callable right here, this method, or it's actually a function inside of our module. And we are going to listen for case reports as the sender. So anytime a case report goes through a FSM transition, it will fire this post-transition signal, and then we will basically have these arguments available to us: the instance, the name, the source, and the target. And this would be an example, for example, if you wanted to send email, or if you wanted to batch report and put them off into third-party auditing software, or if you're doing some kind of metrics or instrumentation, this would be a great way to instrument along the way as every workflow transition that modifies that object does it. Which, speaking of, a lot of times this is very common. You want to know who did what, right? Sometimes you want to know who the user is, you want to know what they're doing. And I kind of mentioned this already, the fact that we had to develop a custom middleware to get around this if you're running things as a management command or doing it from the Django debug prompt. And you still want to be able to call those transitions as you would as if you had a full-blown web request. What's nice though is we can actually, there's an add-on package for FSM, and I'll get into that later, that allows us to do that quick and easily with a simple decorator, and I'll show that in a minute. Here's another example of calling that current user middleware. The previous example was a permission. So in this case, we're getting the current middleware to get the user as part of a permission. But you may also want to be able to get the current user as part of your transition. So in this case, the permission was the can edit or can reject, but we want to be able to check that user and actually do some action based on the current user. And we don't always get the user sent to us when we click on the various transitions inside the site. You'd have to either get it out of the request, or you would have to go and use some custom middleware to be able to get that. If you have a very large site and you have a lot of concurrent transactions going on simultaneously, which is the definition of concurrent, Django FSM actually does support concurrent locking. So we can make sure that if two people are editing an item and both of them are clicking on a transition, the Django FSM has a mix-in you can use to basically handle some of those guarantees against race conditions for concurrently executed transactions. There's a couple things you have to satisfy to make sure on your code side that this works correctly. They're all kind of mentioned in the docs, but you always have to run the save method on objects, and that on an object within the Django DB atomic transaction block. But as long as you follow the guidelines, you can actually have this run for a highly concurrent system and handle those errors gracefully for multiple transactions on the same, or transitions on the same object. And then I mentioned some other benefits around having an audit log. So we have the ability to use, there's an actual additional add-on for Django FSM called Django FSM Log. And if you add this additional FSM under log by decorator in addition to your transition, this will take this data and actually log it into an audit log for you automatically. So you kind of get a nice benefit of transition logging support or audit log support. So now you can see the full history of an object. So the initial state gets set because we set that in our FSM field. Even when that happens, so the creation of a model inside of your application would trigger this FSM log by. And then each time it's moved from one state to another, or even inside the same state. In this example here, where we're using the edit transition, every time the item was edited, we would get a logging saying that it was edited with what time, who did it, and like the various, you can obviously log more data or less data depending on what your application needs are. But now you get that nice application log for your models. Now, what you kind of, again, have to change your mindset and go all in on Django FSM, because if you start using this, if you only use it in a few places, you're going to want to use it in more places. And if you aren't using it everywhere to start with, you're going to have missing data, or you're going to have gaps in the data available to you. So if you're going to start using this tool, I'd investigate looking at using it across a lot of your models so you can actually leverage this nice audit log functionality. So what if you want to use the Django admin? Well, luckily there's an add-on for you. You can actually access those transitions automatically through the Django admin if you use the Django FSM admin. This will add additional buttons into the admin, allowing you to trigger those transactions, and it does it in the context based on those methods that allow you to query who can do what, when, and where. So they're actually controlled because you don't want to make a mess. If you go around your Django FSM admin, manually changing workflow fields, you're not going to trigger other side effect transactions that are supposed to happen as part of that normal transition. Now, with the FSM admin add-on, it does have a setting of FSM admin force permit equal true. I'd recommend setting that because it will basically make your workflow state read-only in the Django admin so that people can't mess with it unknowingly and mess up the application or the state of the application, and will require them to use the FSM admin buttons that are in the admin to actually action every transition to move it from state to state to state. So now you have to explicitly use that transition method to move that variable in your workflow state. Now, time for some of the bonus material. Django FSM does come with a management command, which is pretty awesome. I showed you that graphiz tool, or the graphiz syntax, earlier on in the presentation. The Django admin tool that comes with the FSM allows you to now run graph transitions, and this graph transitions can produce a dot file, or optionally you can just have it output directly into a ping or graphics file if you want to view it. But now you can actually produce a dot file based on the actual code. So it'll look at the various FSM state choices, the initial states, the transitions, and who can do them where, and produce that same graphiz output. Make sure, when you do run it, you have to have the graphiz module installed. I don't think that its setup.py is configured to automatically bring that in, so you have to manually install the graphiz into your virtual environment. But once you do, you will get a very nice graphical representation of the initial state. So initial state going into draft, with the state of, or the action of submit going into administrative processing, and all these are automatically generated solely based on the code in your project. What's really nice about this is it's so much easier to describe or to review or to kind of visually gut check that you've got it all correct, because you've got a nice visual that shows you all the lines where everything's leading, and it'll be pretty obvious if some transition or some line is going into a direction you didn't necessarily expect. It's also much easier to discuss, say, with the business side of the house, how an object is supposed to flow through a business process when you can show them a nice picture versus trying to describe it to them or show them code, which they will never understand necessarily. Not because they aren't capable, it's just not what they want to do. They want to see a nice visual, and the Django FSM actually gives you the ability to do that very, very easily. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining me today and talking about workflows in Django and letting me kind of reminisce about workflows in Plone. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. You can find me on Twitter. I will be around in the Slack chat rooms all day long, so don't hesitate to come hit me up on that as well. I would love to talk to everyone who's here at the conference. And again, I thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mary Beth, for moderating my session.